And we're back.
Great. Welcome back, everybody. We're into hour 2 of Inclusive Design 24. You can track us with the hashtag on Twitter, ID24. That's also the place to ask questions. And I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of those. Really looking forward to our next speaker, Eric Bailey. Eric's a user experience designer out of Boston, and he's going to be talking to us about CSS media queries, and specifically some of the lesser known ones that can be put to good use in terms of accessible design and testing. So over to you, Eric.
Great, thank you so much. So let's see here. All right, can everyone see my screen? Great.
No, we're still seeing you.
Oh, that's a problem. Here we go.
Perfect.
All right, so it's 2017 and responsive design is now table stakes for any project on the web. But sometimes it seems like our process gets in the way of what we're actually trying to do. We seem to be obsessed with checking off boxes. Is there an iPad view? Can you use it in a screen reader? What's the time to first paint? These are means to an end, but we need to keep the big picture in mind, which is building experiences that work anywhere and for anyone. Inclusive design teaches us that it's more than just these boxes. Where's the test for holding a screaming toddler while trying to make lunch reservations? And where's the test for looking at a map to the restaurant in the noonday sun? CSS is often overlooked as something to take advantage of when it comes to doing accessibility work, but it has a lot of potential when viewed through the lens of inclusive design. Assumptions are the antithesis of inclusive design, so let's begin with some level setting. So what is the web? Well, it's many things to many people, but at its core, it's about content. And that might sound kind of glib, so to put it another way, it's about communicating and acting on information. So what is the web? Structurally, this is the ideal. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, a nice and tidy separation of concerns. However, it is the web, so it's going to be weird. Lately, it's begun to feel more like these concerns are starting to blur. And that's not necessarily a value judgment, it just is. But it does feel like because of these choices, we're leaving some people out in the cold. So let's set a common understanding to talk about this more. HTML describes meaning, and it describes meaning semantically. It's an ordered hierarchy of content, not an arbitrary stack of divs. I would say this isn't an idealized situation, but unfortunately that's usually not true in the real world. JavaScript adds behavior, it does not create structure. This might seem like an oversimplification, and you're right, this is a CSS talk. CSS creates priority. Remember, at its core, the web is about content, and appearance really just is the visual priority of content. So, played to their strengths, these three technologies working together make the web accessible. That's one of the founding principles of the web, and honoring it makes compliance easier. So what is compliance? Well, I've always thought it's weird that human-centered design is a specialty in our field. We build interfaces for people, so of course you want people to be able to use them. At its core, audit compliance really just is a formalized set of checks that everyone's agreed on that guarantees everyone can operate an interface regardless of ability. But you know, that's baseline. It can be so much more than that. So what is web compliance? Well, responsive design is adapting design to an unknown browser. You don't make an assumption about where it will be accessed. Inclusive design is adapting design to an unknown user. You don't make an assumption about who will use it. So, played to their strengths, these two methodologies working together can cast the widest possible net for people. And that's important because as more and more services necessary to living everyday life go online, it is vital to make sure everyone can use them. So what is a browser? Well, if your entry point is a desktop, chances are it'll be either Edge or Safari. But then there's also the other popular browsers and their mobile counterparts. Mobile is already a very common entry point for the web, and sometimes it's the only option if you're economically disadvantaged. Then there's the newcomers and the slightly less popular yet totally legitimate browsers and their developer editions. And don't forget that we tend to be Western-centric, but that's rapidly changing. Remember, it's the World Wide Web, not the wealthy Western web. So the point here is browsers are impossible to corral, and it might seem intimidating, but that's actually a good thing. Different users have different needs, and we don't want to be prescriptive because we can't know all of our users' needs all the time or how they go about satisfying them. Inclusive design embraces that. So what's a browser? Browsers are ubiquitous, but we still don't really think of them that way. When we see the word browser, typically people think Google Chrome on desktop. The way we interact with content changes constantly. This is Lynx, an early text-based browser. And browsers can also use a lot of different interaction modes. Here, a screen reader can display all the links on a page as an ordered list. And browsers might be on platforms you might not immediately be thinking of. The Sony PlayStation ships with one built in. We also tend to make assumptions about nearly every aspect of our audience. Here's a LeapPad, a tablet targeted towards kids. And we also make assumptions based on price. Here's a $30 touchscreen smartphone with a color display and a camera. And here's a Kindle, a luxury device with a slow monochromatic display. We also assume that devices will come through traditional channels and be used as intended. Here's a chip, a full-color touch display computer with a non-standard screen size that can get a browser hacked onto it in minutes. And here's an oscilloscope that runs Internet Explorer. We also tend to assume a lot about form factor. It's a fridge, and yes, it's real. You can go out and buy it right now, but it's really an immobile, low-power browser with a long product lifespan. And we don't know what the future will be like. The web itself was a surprise. Think about how much it's changed in only 20 years. And I mean, do you know where it'll be in the next 20? It could be your car's windshield, contact lenses, maybe even the steam in your morning shower. I guarantee you that whatever it is, there's going to be some sort of browser involved in that future. The web isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And by making things as robust as possible in the present, you're making them adaptable, which is great for weathering the seas of change. This is embracing inclusive design in the short term to do the heavy lifting for us in the long term. So how does CSS fit into all this? After all, this is a talk about media queries. Well, that depends on how you talk about it. So writing the correct CSS once is pretty easy. Making that CSS work in all situations and for all people is the hard part. That's a quote by Mika Godbolt, senior design developer at Microsoft. For me, working in all situations and for all people falls into the domain of media queries. So how do I talk about media queries? Media queries describe meaning and context. So close your eyes for a second and imagine you're in a dark room with some friends and there's an elephant in it. Reach out and touch it and describe what you're experiencing. The tusks feels like spears. The trunk feels like a snake. The tail feels like a rope. The legs feel like wooden stumps. That's kind of how I think about media queries. You have this platonic ideal of a site floating out there in the ether with different browsers describing what it is from their perspective. And you can open your eyes now if you haven't already. So the basics. As a consultant, I see a few repeated patterns when working with other people's CSS. And that usually boils down to blindly copying and pasting without knowing all the potential of the technology. Another tell are libraries that make writing media queries easier, but at the expense of leaving other features out. And that's not necessarily a value judgment. People have deadlines, and hey, if it works, it works. Hopefully, however, I can give you a few more tricks to share with your team. So the absence of support for media queries is, in fact, the first media query. That's a quote from Brian Rieger's landmark Rethinking the Mobile Web talk. So what you want here are sensible defaults to accommodate the unknown. You want larger type and comfortable line height to accommodate concerns such as farsightedness and dyslexia. You want good affordances for interactive areas for motor control issues, and a clear hierarchy of content and chunking of information for cognitive concerns such as reading level. You know, these are good design practices regardless, but you'd be surprised how often it's not observed. So yeah, now let's get on to the actual media query support. So when any device's viewport reaches the minimum width of 30 ems, do the following. This is what we want to do. So how do we get there? Well, here's the syntax. When the media rule keyword of @media is present and the min width of 30 ems media feature occurs, apply these selectors and declarations. So why ems? Well, they accommodate the widest swath of browsers, and most importantly, since they're based on type size, they elegantly and dynamically accommodate browser zoom. A lot of exhaustive research has been done on this, and your pixel value use case isn't as clever as you think it is. And Rems fall apart in some really obscure edge cases. So trust me, use ems, use ems. So now let's up the complexity a little. When a device with a screen's viewport reaches a minimum width of 30 ems, do the following. So how do we get there? With a media type of screen and a minimum width of 30 ems, apply these selectors and declarations. The media type is a subtle but important distinction. It targets screens. So what other media types are there? Here's all the media types listed in the documentation. All targets all media type devices. Aural targets speech and sound synthesizers. Braille targets Braille tactile feedback devices. Emboss targets page Braille printers. Handheld targets small or handheld devices. Print targets printers. Projection targets projected presentations. Screen targets computer screens. Speech targets speech synthesizers. TTY targets teletypes and terminals. TV targets television type devices. Only all print, screen, and speech have wide enough support to be used with confidence. Of those four, speech is tricky because of the lack of any real support for aural CSS properties. Yes, it exists, and yes, it would be awesome if we could use them. Aural CSS is intended to tell digitized voice how it should read content, the same way regular CSS tells the browser how to visually display content. This is good for screen readers, but don't forget that digital assistants are becoming very popular. Print is often overlooked, but more people print web pages than you'd think. CSS features like before and after pseudo elements let us create meaningful artifacts like printed URLs for links and descriptions of the main takeaway for interactive visualizations. I've even seen QR codes for long, difficult to type URLs that pre-configure state, which goes to show a little consideration can go a long way UX-wise. Another interesting thing I'd like to point out here, handheld projection and TV have all been deprecated because what is a TV and what is a projector? Good inclusive design principles obviates the need for these distinctions. If your color contrast ratio and type size are proper, you don't have to worry about targeting a projector. Another thing I'd like to point out is the all media type. A lot of browsers will default to using this if you haven't explicitly stated a media type. And this can get you into a lot of trouble via the unintended consequences of the cascade. It's better to get in the habit of declaring screen when you make visual edits. So let's talk about media features. The background from this slide is from one of my favorite scenes from a movie. The Blues Brothers asked the bartender of a backwater bar what kind of music they usually play, and she answers, "Oh, we got both kinds. We got country and Western." And that's kind of how I feel about media features. In addition to browser height and width, we have 8 other media features available to work with. So aspect ratio determines the device's ratio between the height and width. Color determines the presence of color. Color index determines the number of entries in the color lookup table. Grid determines if the device is a grid device, such as a TTY terminal. Monochrome determines if the device uses shades of a single color. Orientation determines if the device is being held in landscape or portrait. Resolution determines the type of display density. And scan determines the type of scanning process it uses, such as progressive scan. These are important. They allow us to really dig into the capabilities of a device, the quality of its screen, its physical orientation in space, how it handles color. However, a lot of the time in these lists, you will also see these deprecated features, device aspect ratio, device height, and device width. Simply put, don't use them. Remember, it's near impossible to know what a device is, but we can react to how a device behaves. Like programming languages, media queries also have logic. It's pretty basic, but also pretty powerful in the right hands. The @media declaration itself is an if statement. If the browser supports @media, do something. You can chain with and, so target screens with both a minimum height of 20 ems and a minimum height of 30 ems, or allows you to apply this or that, target anything with a max width of 10 ems or a minimum width of 20 ems, but nothing in between. And you can exclude with not. Target anything with a max width display of 10 ems that isn't monochrome. So why is all of this so great? With good namespacing discipline, you can adapt your content to best fit the device it will be consumed on without knowing specifically what that device is. Use media queries to write small surgical tweaks that enhance the class and not the page the class is placed on. Here, the theme background class can safely remove images for devices that would break if they tried to display them, and remove backgrounds from media that would choke on rendering them. People still use grid displays and still print web pages, and not for the reasons you'd initially think. For example, I've got a terminal powered by WebKit open on my computer right now. So, armed with these expanded capabilities, how do we go about best using them? Well, first, set your breakpoints based on ergonomics and not devices. Think about how we position ourselves around our devices, and remember that you don't always have hands to do it. Positioning is a great baseline for setting type. Ask yourself, is the type sufficiently large enough to read when you hold the device in your palm, or place it on your lap, or when you're sitting at a desk, or when you're across the room? In fact, take a moment to think about how you're viewing this presentation right now. Type is the cornerstone of any interface. Once you have that established, you can build outwards with confidence. With regard to media queries, a very smart guy called Brad Frost advises us to not go overboard, to treat layout as an enhancement, and to let content determine breakpoints. And so you want to remember not to think in terms of audience, but in terms of people. People aren't always going to be on a WebKit browser or a Windows machine, but they will be reading the web. Don't target common device screen sizes, even if your analytics guy wants you to. You have people that use iPads, not iPad users, and that's a subtle yet very important distinction. I'd also like to point out another @rule, supports. Although it is not technically a media query, it is very much in keeping with the spirit of this presentation. Supports allows us to construct what is known as a feature query, which lets you adjust the interface based on what level of compliance the browser has for modern CSS features. That ensures that everyone gets a high quality experience regardless of device. In the example, the site's text would get a high contrast fallback that would have otherwise been illegible when rendered by a browser that does not support background blend modes, which is perfect for those gradient loaded full page hero screens that seem to be so in vogue these days. And speaking of namespacing, components make things easier to manage. If you're using a CSS preprocessor, you can include the media query inside of the component partial, and it will export as valid CSS. This helps us make robust components and makes your code easier to understand. Remember, inclusive design principles can extend to code. So minifiers will organize and optimize the NCSS. Let robots mind the kinds of things that robots are good at minding. So for example, the CSS nano part of the process maintains the semantics of the style sheet you pass it, but it does stuff like remove redundant properties and leading zeros and standardize the kinds of quotes used. This makes things incredibly friendly for server-side compression. These micro optimizations ultimately assist low bandwidth users by creating the smallest possible download. And this is good for everyone. Developing countries, rural areas, people with metered data plans, people on the bus, train or conference Wi-Fi, people with Comcast, and even rich nerds on the subway trying to read the documentation an hour before deadline and failing to recognize the irony of the situation. So on to the obscure stuff. High contrast mode is a setting that makes interfaces legible for people experiencing low vision. On this example, the logo on the Boston Globe is not visually apparent when high contrast mode is enabled. This is bad because logos that link home are a common affordance on the web people use to navigate. And remember that high contrast doesn't always mean a low vision disorder is present either. Pro tip, max brightness and high contrast mode enabled allows you to use your laptop in the garden. Looks ugly but functional. That's advice some guy on Twitter is sharing on how to use a computer when harsh glare is present. He's not a specialist or an industry rock star. He's just some guy on Twitter making technology work for him and not the other way around. The high contrast mode media query only works in Edge on Windows for now. In the example, we're telling the SVG icon in a button to match the color of the button label, whatever the label color might be set to. And I'm saying set to because Windows high contrast colors are mapped to CSS system color keywords. This is important because Windows allows you to create custom high contrast themes, so these colors could hypothetically be anything. Here's a mapping of the content types and the relevant keywords that'll allow you to work with high contrast mode best. Text maps to window text, links map to the A tag, selected text maps to highlight text and highlight, button label maps to button face, and background maps to window. I had actually written an article about this on CSS Tricks that tried to use static color declarations, but the keywords were then pointed out to me by my friend Amelia Belmead-Royds, which is a classic case of a man stumbling onto something a smarter woman already knew about. So reduced motion, what's that? Well, it's exactly what it says it is. It allows you to target users who have explicitly stated a preference for less motion in the UI animation. This is great for people with vestibular disorders or ADHD, or for people like me, impatient curmudgeons who have no time for watching gratuitous UI animation over and over again. This media query only works in Safari on macOS and iOS, and only when reduced motion is enabled in the operating system preferences. In the background, in the example, we're moving animation from a large background. We could also potentially slow it down or simplify things in the code if the use case requires the animation in order to convey critical information. Like high contrast mode, these tweaks are there for those who need them to make the experience work regardless of circumstance. And not a lot of people are aware of these two features, but that doesn't mean we should ignore using them because of it. You might be in a situation where you're not seeing the personal benefit, or you are, but your boss might not see the business case. And it's important to remember here that disabilities are more than just screen reader support. They're a spectrum of concerns. Inclusive design teaches us also that disabilities can be conditional. Harsh glare, a fever, a broken arm, not knowing the native language, or just getting older. Unfortunately, we also live in an age where people can and will use disability triggers as attack vectors, such as deliberately sending a journalist with epilepsy seizure-inducing tweets. So advocate for your future self, and in doing so, advocate for others. Okay, let's talk about the future. The writing is on the wall, and by wall, I mean the specs. It's feature queries. Feature queries are media queries for user preferences. Existing media queries have display on lockdown, so now it's all about letting our users tell us what they want and responding to it. We've had a taste of this with the last two examples, so let's see what's coming down the pike. Color gamut allows you to manipulate images based on the color profile of the display. But inclusive design concerns really should be handled with proper contrast ratios and not gamut shenanigans. If you're using images to communicate large amounts of critical information, you'll probably want to rethink your content strategy. I'm including this for the sake of completeness, but I'm sure someone more clever than me will figure out something cool to do with it. Interaction covers the new pointer and hover media features, which go together like chimpanzees and tuxedos. These two features can adjust the display based on how we interact with the device. Pointer reacts to the accuracy of the device's primary form of input. So you have coarse, which is a pointing device with limited accuracy, fine, which is a very accurate pointing device, and none, and there's no pointing device present. It's important to note primary is the operative word here, since there are devices that can accept multiple forms of input. Here's a Microsoft Surface. It's a device with a touchscreen, a trackpad, a stylus, and a wireless mouse. Keep in mind this sort of thing when you start messing around with stuff like clickable areas, and remember that individuals with motor control issues may augment their devices with specialized pointing tools. And that honestly, it's just easier to work with the cascade and create sensible defaults from the get-go. Hover capability is also determined by the device's primary input mechanism. So you have hover, which is a pointing device of limited accuracy, on demand. So a device can emulate hover, and none, so there's no hover capability. And kind of like, just tie back to Cordelia, as a rule, I don't like interfaces that utilize hover to expose functionality. It's a throwback from a desktop and mouse-centric era, and in addition to issues with discoverability, it's also problematic for people with motor control issues, to say nothing of technological literacy concerns. I think it's also worth mentioning here that small devices aren't always lacking in hover capability, and the opposite also applies. Larger devices might not have hover capability either. iPad Pros, anyone? All right, so let's talk about media queries that speak to the display itself. Display mode allows us to change things around based on how the browser itself is presented. And so that's with regards to how it displays Chrome, if it's full screen, if it's standalone like a native app, or if it's like a standalone native app with small exceptions such as the browser's back and forward buttons. And as progressive web apps become more popular, this becomes more important. The inclusive design angle here is a low bandwidth battle for the home screen one, where web apps can behave like native apps while still being open and interoperable. The web is becoming a first-class citizen for mobile OSs, which is huge because the accessibility of Android apps stinks. And HTML as a format is just far more accommodating to assistive tech. Update checks how quickly the device is able to modify the appearance of content on the screen. Slow, fast, or none. This one is pretty straightforward. Here you're able to more granularly craft experiences for e-ink or lower power devices. So a gentleman by the name of Andres Gallant wrote a great article for CSS Tricks about putting all of them together. Mobile, small, portrait, slow, interlace, monochrome, coarse, non-hover first. Oof, that's a mouthful. Mobile first was great. Was a great starting point when we were first figuring out what this whole responsive design thing was. But in our everything has a browser now future, this update on the term provides a rock solid future-friendly foundation to build from. Light level uses the device's sensors to determine how bright the environment is. This media query makes me feel old because we now assume that the majority of devices will ship with some sort of camera built into it. There are 3 options for light level: normal, dim, and washed. This is cool because washed has been discussed as a supplement for high contrast mode. So remember, with media query logic, we can lump the two together and not have to write redundant code. Let's also note that normal lighting is rated to what the manufacturer describes as ideal for the screen. But since these technologies are interoperable, there's also the potential to override them, say with a system-wide preference toggle or a browser extension. Scripting allows us to target JavaScript or the lack thereof. There are 3 values: enabled, none, and initial. Enabled is if the user can support JavaScript, while none is if they have it disabled or it fails to load. Remember, even though we live in the age of monolithic JavaScript frameworks, every user technically does not have JavaScript until they do. And this might get me some subtweets from guys with fancy Twitter bios, but the larger the JS payload, the larger the chance of failure. And if you're thinking this smells a lot like arguing for progressive enhancement, you're right. So initial only indicates that scripting is enabled during the initial page load, but is not supported afterwards. Examples are printed pages or pre-rendering network proxies that render a page on a server and send a nearly static version of the page to the user. And it's a little tricky. The authors are still trying to figure out what the difference is between a server-rendered page and a page with deferred loading JavaScript. Personally, I think these are champagne problems. Performant web pages are oftentimes also accessible pages. For example, Lighthouse, Google's progressive web app analyzer, uses an accessibility audit as a primary scoring metric. Inverted colors are the poor man's high contrast mode. Most operating systems can do it. I use it when using my iPhone at night a lot. And again, you can chain it using the logic described earlier in the presentation. It's worth also mentioning that Chrome has an extension for it, which is a good reminder that you shouldn't be in the business of trying to do device sniffing, especially for assistive technology. So a practical application of this would be the double inversion technique, where you invert inverted multimedia. So it's a simple and powerful selector, and it ensures that content remains legible regardless of what mode it's being viewed in. Our old friend reduce motion is also listed. So all that work you did for Apple devices, soon it'll be available to everyone. And finally, we have custom media queries. This one is a little weird to wrap your head around, so bear with me. If you weren't aware, CSS is getting support for a special syntax called custom properties. These special properties are variables that are declared in the root selector to give them global scope. The root selector being equivalent to the HTML tag selector. They are key value pairs that print out whatever string you have defined. So here I've been using them to do some really simple theming work. And the cool thing about CSS custom properties is that unlike preprocessor variables, they are accessible via JavaScript on the live site. Previously, to send data back from CSS to JavaScript, we often had to resort to hacks like writing CSS values in plain JSON in the CSS output and then parsing it in JavaScript, and that's gross. But now, gotten the CSS styles targeted in JavaScript, you can manipulate them. So here I'm switching the values for the primary and secondary brand colors. And then you can take it one step further and work the logic into dynamic components. This button toggles inverting the site's theme. It's a simple example, but hopefully it makes some sense. So in the same vein, you'll soon be able to declare custom media query properties. They're functionally the same, an author-defined custom string, only this time you're using the @custom_media declaration to create them. Like CSS custom properties, you can use them in the site's CSS. The easy one here is a set once and update everywhere approach, but don't forget that you can also manipulate them with JavaScript. I'll admit, this amount of power is potentially very intimidating, but I think there's also a lot of potential for being future friendly. We're leaving the doors wide open to accommodate the unknown, and a lot of that could be interfacing with assistive technology we can't even dream of yet. There's going to be a lot of wonderful things written by brilliant people that we'll be seeing in the coming years, and I personally can't wait to use them. I'd appreciate any feedback or pointers you might have for this presentation. I know I've been running a little early, 30 minutes in, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about the material. Here's how to reach me. I'll also be posting slides with links to the resources I use to develop this talk. By day, I'm a consultant for a design and development agency called Cantina. So give me a holler if you're interested in meeting up in the Boston area. Thank you for your time, and thank you to ACS for their transcription work. And thank you to the Paciello Group for this amazing opportunity. I hope you enjoy the rest of ID24.
Well, that was great. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. Let me fix this. Yeah. So went a little faster, but here we are.
That's always the way it goes when you're out live.
Yeah.
But some great, Twitter comments again coming in from all sorts of different places. Lots of people really liking the practical advice you were giving about, deprecated values and practical ways to use these media queries. So yeah, thank you. Really, really interesting talk.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
Now, Eric, this is Carl. I was interested to hear your comments about Rems versus Ms. Can you expand that a little bit? Because I think that's kind of the kind of thing that some people might get a little bit confused about.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Just kind of like brass tacks. M's are scoped to the font size of the current container element, whereas Rems are scoped to the root font size of the document. So if the body tag has font size of 20 pixels, one Rem is 20 pixels. So the trouble with this is, number one, you have legacy browser support. Some browsers don't support Rems if you're going way back. And then you get into like that crazy, ridiculous edge case of zooming with Rems declared in an old browser and potentially not having it sized to like having some sort of viewport manipulation where it just kind of doesn't know what to do. So it goes with what it knows, which is it doesn't know anything, and it just statically doesn't zoom anything, which is the point of screen zoom.
So from an accessibility perspective, one of the things that we run into a lot when it comes to Zoom is when stuff gets hidden, and it's really surprising sometimes the way that certain things can get hidden when it comes to like fixed heights of containers where the text inside is not a fixed height, and so like people will think, okay, my font size will expand to whatever 200% or whatever of the default, but the container itself could have a fixed size, and that's gonna trip them up from an accessibility perspective. Do you have any hints for people who are writing CSS to try to avoid that sort of stuff? I mean, other than like not do it, right? So
yeah, that's the wise answer. I try to use relative units whenever possible. I don't like it's kind of like in my mind like the golden age to write components now, because there's great support for these things, and I usually just get in the habit of command plus plus plus, command minus 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 as I'm developing, just to watch for these kinds of collisions.
right.
I'll have it in the slide notes. There's an article I'd seen that's really good about what you do is you mix Rems and Ms. So Ms for the type and Rems for the components sort of padding and margin, and spacing. And the idea there is that the type will scale relative to the scale of the component, and the component is going to scale relative to the document font size, which is a kind of like word salad of jargon, but I've seen it in action, and it's really like it takes that zooming experience and actually makes it a lot more elegant than just kind of things blow up and cram against the walls of the browser.
Yeah, because we see that sometimes where there is this motion towards component-based UIs, especially through things like Angular and React and stuff like that, and Vue and even more. And then what happens is, we tend to think of these things as an atomic level component that then we have to make them work together. And and I mean, I personally, and I think people have a little bit of dogmatic reaction to the idea of having our CSS tied to our components and all that sort of stuff. But I kind of like it. But yeah, some of that stuff is also going to be tricky, and I like the idea of letting the document level sort of handle that. For the component too.
The weird, like, from the UX designer view of things, like everyone's all about like, oh, you don't have pages, you have flows. But I mean, the reality of the situation is you're going to have a page, and like that page will have state, but you can't escape the fact that at a certain point it's going to be tags in a document, and you really need to like start and make that your kind of your foundational experience. I actually like, on the components argument, like I like working with them in that, like, from an accessibility kind of compliance standpoint, they're very scoped, and so you can kind of run your battery of automated tests on them, and then that kind of frees you to start to look about like, okay, well, with the confidence that this self-enclosed element works, how does it react when I stick it next to this other guy? And then, like, what happens if I start doing weird stuff to them?
Yeah, exactly. So it's an idea of, and I think some other people have done sort of this design, the atomic design stuff, with an idea that it's going to have to be put in a view of some sort at a bigger level, especially at an application. I mean, it's a different story, of course, when it's a text-based website or a content-based website or something like that. But when we're talking about applications, that's when it can get really ugly too, when it's not handled right.
Yeah, and I guess I should also say, like, even though I just dropped buzzword after buzzword, like, I think this approach works really well, even just for largely static non-app sites. Again, the component kind of based thing. It's very freeing to kind of focus on something, zoom out, focus on something else, zoom out. And then I guess to your point of, the Angulars and the Reacts of the world, just because it is a single page app doesn't mean we're free from the responsibilities of compliance. A lot of people think that if you're clever about your React setup, somehow that frees you from the need to make it accessible, and that's kind of gross. So I can hear the subtweets already.
Let's check and see if there's any subtweets going on now. Yeah. Well, that's all. That's all I have. The Bill or Leonie or Matt, do you guys have anything?
No, other than just to add that was an awesome talk. Clearly, Twitter is liking it. I'm sure Eric has noticed his notifications probably going off like mad on his phone if he's got them turned on.
Nope, I'm going to turn my phone on.
There's one.
If not, you'll get the celebrated 20+ probably beside your name.
There's one thing, Eric, you talked about that I must admit interested me, and that was the media types for oral and speech.
Yes.
And sort of tangential to that, have you got any thoughts around what's now called the CSS speech module?
I would love it. I think the oral CSS properties were ahead of their time. But that also sounds kind of weird because it also in my mind kind of should have been part of it from the get-go. I'm going to trip over my words here, but I think, especially with concerns to all the major devices now ship with a narrator built into them in some capacity. And a lot of people don't consciously recognize that they shift between these operating modes. And the one thing I really like is the notion of being able to create kind of a user experience with oral hierarchies. So, a single one voice for certain kinds of interaction or certain kinds of content and another for another. When I do testing, you can actually set VoiceOver to have separate voices for separate kinds of describing a link versus reading the content on the page. I don't know.
Right. Yes.
Do that. That's what I like to do because it's oh, this is these are the words, and this is the technology.
Yep. So what do you think? Because I agree with you. I really like the idea that we can have a audible kind of experience. So calling attention to something. If a push notification comes through, there's design visually that calls attention to it, and just increasing the volume or the pitch of the voice that your screen reader uses or something would be great. But every time I've ever talked or written about this, immediately other screen reader users say, but it's so open to abuse.
Yeah.
I don't want my thing yelling at me just every time an advert's on a page. And part of me, I must admit, thinks, well, if we want equality, that kind of means we have to put up with the dreadful audio experience like everybody else gets a dreadful visual one, right? But I'm not sure. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, it's also, I'd be curious. It's just interesting to hear you say that because I've been kind of noodling with it in my head, and I think for some users that use screen readers, that's their voice. That's they're normal, they're everyday, they're regular, and if manipulating that without their consent, is that an ethical thing to do? I like the idea that it is interoperable, so you can opt into it, but to your point, it's rife for abuse. I guess, I don't know, but I also think you shouldn't fear the future.
Right. Yeah. And I think making it opt in or opt out, giving people the choice, I think that would be a big part of the solution. If we were to see more implementations, but I like it. I get bored listening to everything in the same voice.
Yeah.
I don't know about other screen reader users, and just a little bit of texture, bit of variation, I think actually could, really make a difference.
Yeah.
Leonie, you reminded me of something. there's we see a lot of times in audits where there's iframes that don't have titles and stuff like that, and maybe we could have those iframes are almost always going to be advertisements and stuff. So maybe if we had a role equals advertisement, you know what I mean, That way,
Mhm.
you know, you could really
Well,
investigate.
then we can just hide the advertisement.
Well, this is this is what I'm guessing Matt you do. Matt, you do as well as a JAWS user. Is I get JAWS just to ignore inline frames on pages with a lot of advertising. I just tell
Yeah.
JAWS to ignore
Or,
them, and
I
they
mean,
just go away, and it's
yeah, I mean,
lovely. Yeah.
And you never see it again once you do it, which
Right.
is great.
Yeah, that's it. Never again.
The thing that I
Ever.
think is that the key is to give the user the capability of doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think as long as you give them the capability of doing it, and I think that the example you gave, Eric, was, you know, we don't want to necessarily hear the word link after every link or graphic after every graphic.
Mhm.
And so as long as we can actually be able to tag, you know, sounds and voices based on what our preferences is,
Mhm.
you know, we can have a different pitch, a different voice. And I think that's the key. Give them the power to do it. And then as long as we're using traditional technology, we should be able to do it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, as we move into the era of speech interfaces, you know, Google Home, the Echo, you know, Microsoft's just released a Cortana thing of the same kind of ilk. I think Apple's just announced one too.
Yep.
You know, voice interface design, audio interface design is going to get more and more interesting, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's you know, it's interesting. Like, I just, you know, in my day job, I just wrapped up a chatbot project, and like,
Mhm.
there's a ton of nuance, and I think, you know, it was interesting because like one of the things I did do is just go back to the screen reader and be like, all right, what are the lessons here I can learn, and like,
Mhm.
what problems have already been solved, you know, many years ago,
Yeah.
repeatedly over and over again. So like, I don't know, it was nice to bridge the two.
Yeah, that's great, and I love the idea that CSS, you know, can be lifted out of purely visual design into audio design as well. I think that's really exciting.
It's getting there. It's, you know, we're slowly moving the needle, so that's fun.
Okay, so I think we're just kind of coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to throw the same question at you that I threw Cordelia at the end of her talk. If you could recommend one thing that people could go out there and change tomorrow to make their stuff more inclusive, what would it be?
Test all day, every day. You think you're done testing, test some more, and if you're done testing, give it to somebody else. Yeah, like the high contrast mode stuff, especially the reduced motion. The big thing I try to petition for is introduce it into your testing scripts, not like automated, but like when a QA person does it, and then B, like, make sure you're in a situation where when you're in these modes, you're communicating what you need to communicate, because chances are the browser default may not be what you want. And I'm not saying like completely redo the experience. I'm saying just give it that gentle nudge so you're actually, like, what you're communicating doesn't have to rely on the medium it's being communicated in.
Sounds like pretty good advice to me. Well, Eric, thank you once again for an absolutely tremendous talk. Loads of practical and useful information for ID24. So thank you. Everybody else, you're welcome. We're going to take another 10-minute break. Time to grab some tea and coffee, maybe a Thursday night drink, depending where in the world you are. We're back in 10 minutes with a talk from Jason Kist out of New Zealand. See you in 10.